So anyway, so it's 4 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. So thank you all officially for joining us. It's great to have everybody here. This is our first ever panel from the Community Geographies Collaborative. So this is a really exciting moment, I feel like, in the history of this group, and what's been kind of a slow developing set of programs around developing community geography as a thing, as a subdiscipline within the history of geography. We're going to have hopefully another one of these panels later in the fall that's slated to be about what basically the perspectives of non-academic folks who partner with academics, and what are some things that those folks need to be aware of, but also what are some things that academics need to be aware of in working with those folks. So there'll be a panel of people who aren't currently in academia, but are part of these partnerships and getting their perspective on things. So hopefully keep an eye out for that later this fall. And then I will post this in the Zoom chat later once we get going. There's a questionnaire that was sent out to the Community Geographies Collaborative listserv. If you want to be on that list, go to cgcollaborative.org to do mentoring, peer mentoring relationship. And I'll post that link later on if people want to fill out a questionnaire to be part of that program. So that's just a few preliminary announcements. Let's get to the main event. So it's great to have our panelists here today on the topic of imagining a community geography. I've got 4 or so questions that we're going to run through, but let me introduce our panelists first, and we'll have them do just a brief introduction of themselves after I do introduction. So we've got Latoya Eves, who's at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, who's with us today, Bradley Wilson, who is at West Virginia University, and Patricia Solis, who is at University of New Mexico. I hope I got all those affiliations right. And I'll let them just say briefly, like 30 seconds. Do you want to say anything more about kind of your background and how you come to this conversation? Latoya, let's start with you, since you're on my screen.
I was coerced.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Totally kidding. I am very glad to be invited to the conversation and have been like hanging out on the sidelines of community geography for a little bit, and was really grateful to be involved with the publication and progress in human geography, and being asked to come into that space. So yeah, it's a slow movement towards how I imagine my work should be situated, and how the kinds of projects I would like to pursue, yeah, in conversation with community members, both locally here in Knoxville now that I live here, but also across the South, which is kind of my site of interest. So.
Awesome, thanks. Patricia, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. And Jerry, as much as I really love all our friends in New Mexico, that's not where I'm at. Actually, I'm a little bit farther west. I'm at Arizona State University now, and I was at Texas Tech and Lubbock, so you had me somewhere in between. I think you got it right in your mind somehow.
Sorry about that. Stuff I was going to print out before the conversation.
No worries, but it's really great to be here. And I know we've been talking about some of these ideas for many, many years, even before, there was this sort of coalition into the idea of naming something as a community geography. I think it takes a lot of bubbling up of lots of different ideas before it even reaches the kind of robust level of community geography. And it's just been really amazing to watch that happen, somewhat organically, but also with the amazing leadership of, Jerry, many others, my co-panelists here, and I'm sure many of the attendees. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Right now, I am at ASU, and I am a research faculty in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning here, but my main position is as the executive director of what is called the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience, which is a fully philanthropy funded local Maricopa County initiative to marry the knowledge, expertise, and capacity of the university with the insights, knowledge, data, partnerships in all of the sectors of Maricopa County. So I feel like this is one of my dream job opportunities, and something that really embodies, I think, community geography. I've been working in that kind of space with other sectors all of my career. I opted not to do the traditional tenure track thing just because of that. I had previous stints in nonprofit and government as well. And then for about 12 years, I was the Deputy Director of Research, Strategic Initiatives at the Association of American Geographers, or the American Association of Geographers now.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of background.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Bradley.
Oh, thanks so much for this invitation, and definitely feels, I'd say, similar to Latoya, like an invitation into the conversation around community geographies and what it means. And I feel, yeah, I think about two years ago now, invited to participate in Georgia at Georgia State in that first convening. And I feel like it's been, if I could put it this way, I feel like often driven by my graduate students and young people to focus on certain kind of research areas. And I think that the conversation around community geographies and how to do geography differently, or how to do research, how to teach, and how to do outreach differently is something that a new generation of scholars is really deeply thinking about. And so it feels really good to kind of be in a conversation around what that means and participate in that over the last 2 years and presently. My background is actually kind of as an ethnographer originally, doing research in Central America with farming cooperatives and sort of revolution folks who participated in the Nicaraguan Revolution, Sandinista Revolution in the 1970s and 80s, and then yeah, trying to build community economies in the context of real deep challenges, economic crisis challenges, and then landed here in West Virginia about 10 years ago as an assistant professor. And I feel like, I think that maybe it does capture a bit of what I was doing, working with students and community organizations to develop research and educational opportunities that focus on, doing research in service of community transformation in one way or another, but really focused on food justice. And then that evolved into the establishment of a center about 2 years ago called the Center for Resilient Communities, which is really a product of a lot of different people's work across the state and a lot of students involved. And so maybe share some of that experience today. But thanks so much for the invitation.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, as I said, we've got a series of a few questions here, and we'll kind of see how this goes, but I want to make sure we also leave some time for Q&A at the end. So the first question I had, and these are scribbled notes again from what I had on my PC, but basically the first question is one about the publics we engage with. So as we think about the different crises that we're facing, and community geography tends to be very kind of on the ground focused with everything from climate to white supremacy, COVID, all of these things. One of the real calls of this subdiscipline, I think, is to engage with publics of various kinds, and to think about it as, there are lots of choices we can make about who we engage with. From your all's perspective, who are the kinds of publics we really need to be reaching out to and connecting with as we do this work of engaged research? I'll leave it up, and does somebody want to start first, or I can call on someone?
I'll be the brave one.
Okay, thank you.
And my answer is all of them.
All of them.
Point. But I say that because I'm thinking about all of these publics and all of these crises as being compounding in a lot of ways, in that they have some level of interaction with one another. Like white supremacy is engaged with climate change, is engaged with COVID. And so I think that the compounded nature of that produces vulnerabilities and needs that being on the ground and connected with can really help to co-produce knowledge, which is of course important for community geography. But I think that if there's also a question of focus, meaning is there something more short-term that can be kind of addressed, or like which question can we answer first, or which set of work can we do first to start moving towards a long-term goal, and putting those, connecting both of those things together. Because I think, yeah, I also think that if the question related to questions of co-production of knowledge, then there's reason to take on methods and foci that engage with how community members are, what's happening, like in kind of the day-to-day lived experience, that can be kind of captured and start wrestling with both in the short term and then, kind of in the long term. And I think, with some of the like really current, kinds of the really kind of short term, like concerns, like are around, the like social safety nets that fell away, a month ago. And, that's a really immediate kind of concern for people who we often take up in conversation or do research with on the ground. There's suddenly like a, kind of the basic kind of human needs are no longer being met. And so I think, to me, like, that is one of the short-term kinds of things that can help address kind of long-term concerns, in relationship to how, other phenomena or events or crises begin to like, continue to impact and try to mitigate them in the long term.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with everything that you said, Latoya. And also, I think, make even more explicit the idea that these publics are plural, right? That the power that I think that we can do is more of like a multilateral convening around knowledge co-production than, one-off bilateral projects, which might be an easier way and many times to do it. But that's what I think that the community geography framework, and then the power of being academic actors trying to create research of public value, is that convening power that knowledge and the data can have. And especially as geographers, we can use our techniques, to contextualize in qualitative ways, to, spatially analyze in quantitative ways. We have these kinds of tools and perspectives that we can bring together some of those multilateral perspectives. And so the publics, to me, are going to always be plural. It's harder to do. That's kind of the community of community geography. And also, I just think that the silos that exist in our communities around these kinds of problems that we're really most interested, the pandemic, the systematic racism, climate change, all of these things are systems problems. And that's why I think that we had that impetus to take that plural seriously. And then, when you're asking certain questions, sometimes the people that are affected by those problems are not the people that are going to be making those same decisions about how to solve those problems. And so again, if we can use that powerful framework to connect the dots, that's where I think that we're going to really realize the power of something like a community geography.
Yeah, I like that, the kind of idea of being a bridge. That makes sense to me, of like someone who's able to kind of bring those voices together. Bradley.
Yeah, I was thinking about how to maybe make a really obvious point. Maybe it's just like super obvious, but I feel like I'm just walking out of class right now. So I have 350 students in a class, and I'm like, it's a public, youth, young people, college students enrolled, in our classes, who are walking our halls, who are on campus, who are motivated to address the various issues that are even referenced here. And are trying to, and actually understand their synergy perhaps even better than we do in their lived experience. And so I just was thinking about how sometimes maybe within our academic contexts, or when we think about community and community geography or engaged scholarship, it's always like an adult that we're thinking about doing work with. And perhaps we as adults like assume that that's what we're supposed to be doing. And I just maybe emphasize that, you know, it's 15 and 16-year-olds that are organizing now. It's, you know, it's middle schoolers who are looking at them and saying, you know, that is an age group that I aspire to can make a contribution there. Or it's college students who are, you know, doing really innovative things and have like totally the capacity to be doing that, but are often sort of shunted away from decision making or are not perceived as being central to the conversation. Or and so, you know, whether I'm not sure that I'm necessarily, you know, necessarily do this well, but just thinking about who are communities or publics that we are perhaps not paying close enough attention to. I think youth, you know, young people who are from 13 until 30, that's a pretty big range, but just thinking about young people and to what degree we're engaging, following, you know, them on the process of creating, making our research and our teaching useful. And I was like thinking about, so Bell Hooks has this really powerful conceptualization of education as the practice of freedom. And she makes this point that like our vocation is sacred, like teaching in universities is sacred. And our work is not, she says, quote, our work is not merely to share information, but to share the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. So I think looking to those who are also encouraging us around education itself as a practice of community geography.
Thanks. Any other thoughts on this before we move on to the next question? Space for a little bit of discussion.
I do like, Bradley, that you brought in the idea of youth in there, because we do forget how much they really are in these communities that we are doing research in already, right? So if you are thinking about even just from a physical location, students do live in the setting of our university that we're surrounded by. So if we are perhaps doing some sort of community geography project, not even just in our classroom, which I totally agree with you about, like even that education space, but in the research space as well. So let's say we're, this was an experience that I had here actually a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, when we were still able to do some of the field work that we're hampered now. We were working with, we discovered that people who live in mobile homes are much more likely to die from heat associated illness than people who live in other types of housing. And we actually discovered this, that they were kind of falling between the cracks of our community organizations by, you know, our research with them, getting their data and visualizing their data and seeing what's this gap here. That's where people live in trailer parks and mobile homes. And so we wanted to go in and just do a detailed, you know, better research on what those experiences were. And so I was able to convince our dean of students to somehow give me the list of students who lived in certain zip codes, and we clipped out our study area and we recruited our own ASU students. Someone told me, oh, there's not going to be anybody who lived there. And I was like, you'll be surprised. There were more than 700 students in these two study areas that we were going to do comparative analysis from. And we reached out to them. We gave them gift cards to help us and recruit participants for the study. And it was just a really great, I think, even if they didn't choose to participate, a way to just honor the fact that you do live somewhere. And we we're not just in our classrooms, but in the community where we're also doing research. And that was a really important contribution. And it really helped us, I think, improve our research, because these are private property and it was really hard to do recruitment unless you had people who lived there. So win-win on all sides, not just for education part, but actually engaging them in creative ways in our work where they are physically. So I really like that you brought that up.
If I may, I just want to add one other thing. I think it's, you know, I also echo the the interest in like getting youth involved, and because their perspectives are, you know, so very different, because they don't, you know, like they don't see things from, you know, like the ways that we see them, you know, after, you know, just by the process of aging and by like getting professionalized. And I think that, you know, one of the, you know, kinds of challenges, or perhaps one of the kind of inhibitors to doing some of the youth work is like the IRB process. And I think that a lot of people are just, you know, like challenged by the idea of having to get an extra set of approval to work with people under the age of 18. And I think that's, but that's, constitute, excuse me, a really core component of community engaged work. They, you know, if I think about the, you know, like all of the youth that I know in all the neighborhoods I know, like they walk home from school, or they like, you know, have different interactions with the place that could be really useful for helping us understand problems and trying to get to solutions differently and through a different lens. So thank you, Bradley, for bringing it up, and Patricia for your comments there.
That's a great segue to the second question. So, which is kind of in addition to, I mean, I think bringing up IRB is a great example of this, but what are some potential obstacles that you see that make the kinds of engagement that we need to be doing difficult, right? So institutional barriers would be an example of that, like IRB, or there could be, obviously, I think there's often issues of trust and mistrust between academic communities and their neighbors, issues around funding or resources or things like that. I see we have a question. We'll come back to that. Let's do one more round of, let's answer this question, and then we'll come to the Q&A part of it and see where that goes. So who wants to start with that one? Kind of what are some of the challenges that you see as being most pressing to do this work well, that we need to be addressing and coming up with new models for?
And I'll keep going, probably because I'm dealing with IRB issues right now, and I'm only trying to do adults, but so I might, you know, like this is a challenge for myself as well, you know, like me thinking about, you know, like youth and children as, you know, part of this process, and being willing to take, you know, take the extra time to do good work and to do it justly. I think too, the other kinds of barriers that I thought about, the first being about community members being very wary of institutions, and not just our universities, but also like community institutions. And an example I had was just, I'm working on a project with trying to build a project here in Knoxville with a community group who, you know, is feeling concerned about another community group who is kind of wrestling with, or, you know, kind of enabling like people who have more power in town, like people who have like the foundation money around here, or who like, who own lots of property and that kind of thing, and being really concerned about that impact of large figures of money from people who don't always seem to have the best interest at heart, or like the same kind of values and interests as the community groups. I think that's a pretty, you know, kind of persistent conversation to be thinking about. I mean, our research programs, you know, give us the like insider outsider status, but I think it's, you know, far more complex than just like being an outsider to a community and trying to do the work. It's, you know, the wariness on the ground of people who have exploited them before, or have not had the same kind of goals and mission in mind in terms of long-term engagement and that sort of thing. And I think the other kind of barrier is, you know, my light in my office is time. Sorry, I'll turn it on in a second. But
I can still see it.
Okay, cool. So the other thing is about, like I think community geography falls under the idea of long-term activism, which I think, is pretty explicit and, what people have written and kind of set out for in publications. And so I think that the other kind of challenge is like, the institutional parameters on what needs to be done, and how quickly that, including even for undergraduate students and graduate students, that, can have some impact on what our goals are, and not just the fast scholarship kind of approach, but really doing slow and methodically and being invested in the long-term goals with the community members that we're working with. And I'm going to go turn on my light now.
Oh, no, thanks. Who's next?
I was going to react to that. I feel like that's just such an amazing question, actually, because I think that when you're asking about what are these potential obstacles, some of them you would encounter with different types of research already. But I actually think that if you are going to make a commitment to doing community geography, and especially the way that this community of geographers is laid out, what we mean by that, I think that that's a commitment to wrestle with those obstacles. Like automatically, part of doing the work is that you are going to accept the challenge and the commitment to deal with those institutional barriers in creative ways, and do it not just with some kind of standard, okay, this is how you do it, but actually try to co-create those solutions with the publics that you're trying to be engaging with, right? Because it's a process. It's not just, it's a very integral process of doing community geography that you accept that challenge. You accept the fact that you're going to be navigating some really challenging ethical issues and the insider-outsider questions. And part of the richness, I think, of community geography, the way that I've, read some of my colleagues here and in the audience, is how to think through that and reconcile that with your ability to, try to create change and be a part of it, or try to illuminate the knowledge, bring certain things to light that is necessary to take that long-term, some incremental steps in that long-term project. So I feel like while at one hand we can couch them in terms of these are the potential obstacles, I also think there's another way of looking at this. This is the matter of community geography that we're accepting to be able to try to build both theoretically, empirically, and just daily in our work, and trying to do research in this more meaningful, different way.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I resonate a lot with that. I think that's a great way to put it. This is what it is in a lot of ways. Is that act of engaging with these things and trying to refashion them to something better. Bradley, do you have any thoughts you want to share on this?
Just to echo, I think that when I was preparing this to comment on this, it was time. There used to be this whole adage that it's space that hides consequences from us, and I'm like, no, it's just time. Time, there's time horizons in nonprofit organizations that are trying to have resources to advance certain projects that are on a short term, and they're all competing with each other for scarce resources, at least interpret it that way. You have university timelines that are structuring all of our activities in terms of their expectations. You have the state that's literally syncopated on certain kinds of time frameworks. You have students who are working on time frameworks. You have pre-tenure, post-tenure. You have all of these different time frameworks that are structuring our lives in particular ways. And it can either be, it's a lot to I don't know, I either try to weave all of them together or to try to overcome it. And so I think it's not just it's also a consciousness around time, that it takes a long time to build trust with people. It takes a long time to fail at meeting expectations and then try to win back trust. It's it's also there are betrayals. There's in community work, it's not it's this linear, a project is successful or it's unsuccessful. It's a much longer process of constantly trying to build a level of trust and commitment for change. And in that respect, I go away from youth. I'm like, I don't think youth have developed necessarily, it's like elders in communities can speak about what are the qualities necessary to like sustain a certain kind of commitment to something over a long period of time, you know, and understand what it feels like to lose, like, and not actually have success with something, but like find success in things. So I think that like, to me, I'm thinking a lot about like early on in projects, you know, it's like the difference between a relationship you have with someone that you're just establishing a project with versus somebody who's like, you're still working on something together, but it's not, you know, it's, it's not quite.
We've got some history together. Yeah, I mean, I think that issue of trust is so key, and that's something that it takes a lot of just relational work to establish, because we're working through some histories that are with us and also in the institutions we inhabit and the communities we inhabit. That makes sense.
Yeah, I would add that too, Jerry. It's like the people who have represented your organization in years before, and you have to wrestle with that legacy, even if you weren't a part of it. Those things stay in place, I think, and have to be reckoned with. And you might not even realize that that's there until a ways into those relationships, that's something that you have to be cognizant of and overcome. I just assume that there's probably something there, and then you just try to figure out what that is. Yeah. And I think not just the time, but also the space too. And as geographers, maybe we also take that for granted, right? That there are certain spatial spheres of influence that organizations have or do not have. And I think a lot, especially lately, about the incongruence between decisions and where decisions are made and how those are put in place literally, and the accountability for those decisions, which has a very incongruent geography to the jurisdiction of who has that power and who is affected by those decisions. Like, those things do not line up. Who we're working with and where they are literally, and what kind of influences over their neighborhoods, what, you know, their footprint of power, if you will, versus the organizations that we're working with who supposedly the city, maybe they have certain boundaries over certain decisions, but they may or may not coincide with how we're working with other community partners. And then the way that those decision makers are held accountable are sometimes to somewhere much farther away, to, like Latoya said, some sponsors or you know, other funders or something that doesn't necessarily have the same geographies either. So we've got all these space issues, all these time issues, and it's just a lot to deal with. That is a really, really big challenge. And I know there's one of the attendees is asking about like the definition of community, and I think that that's very literally, again, I don't want to punt the question, but that's part of the process of doing community geography in my mind, is wrestling with those definitions and you know, just being very aware and not taking that for granted, that we're just doing this project and this is what it is. But we're trying to connect those dots and be aware of the time and space, you know, power and agency of the actors that we're dealing with or not, and how those things play in with each other. It's part of that contextual process. And I think I use community and community geography as a much more fluid term without trying to fix a definition. I know that's not a really satisfying answer, but yeah, I don't think we want to reify the idea of community either, and that it's some kind of whole, you know, I think all of us are in agreement about that, and many people have written a lot about that. But just, I think people who might not take this framework would probably gloss over that. Whereas if we're talking about community geography framework, that's always part of the process of trying to define that.
Well, and coming back to the point earlier about, you know, we're always working with multiplicities. We're working with communities that are dynamic, that are heterogeneous, that the community geography is about kind of bringing a community together and working with various publics to try to create a conversation. And so the idea that there is a community that you go work with and that community has one voice, I think is difficult, because there are often these internal relationships and negotiations that Bradley was talking about. And Latoya brought up the example of like community organizations that see each other differently. And it's complicated and it's hard work relationally. So let's pause for a moment here. So Ayodiji Ianda is a graduate or a student member of the CGC board, Community Geographies Collaborative board. And again, if you're interested in kind of being part of the email list for that, you can go to cgcollaboratives.org or CG Collaborative, sorry, no S, .org, and there's a form to sign up there. But Ayodji's been keeping an eye on the Q&A, and I'm going to let him interject here if there's any questions that would be apropos for this moment.
All right, thank you. I think one of the questions, we have 5 questions, and one of the questions that have been partly addressed. We cannot fully address question on the definition of what is community here. You know, it can take us a whole day to do that. So one of the questions we have is, how do we navigate the IRB process where there is need to include young people in community geography research?
So kind of a practical question around how do we think about navigating difficulties of including young people with IRB?
I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer, but I'll give a stab at it. I mean, just honestly, whenever I try to do something challenging and difficult like that, I just try to look for templates and models of people that have, you know, done it successfully or navigated that institutionally. And I'm not really sure if this question is about like the institutional challenges and just the added barriers, or if it's like the on the ground challenges. But either way, I just try to get inspiration from where I see other people have had some success. That's, you know, and every situation is a little bit unique. But I guess that's kind of where I turn to. We're fortunate here at ASU that our IRB is really, really generous and fast and helpful with IRB. So we can always ask for templates and other, you know, where have people been successful at putting these things in place before. So sometimes you've got, you know, people institutionally to look for. I would just say not to struggle alone. That's why I think the collaborative is also good, like trying to get models and specific templates from other people.
All right. So can I read the second answer question? Okay. Bradley, do you want to contribute?
To the second question or the first one?
The first one. Or do you want me to go to the second question?
No, the second question is also cool. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. The second question says to the general panelists, not just anyone in particular. How do the panelists navigate belonging to communities while also researching with them? You know, how do you separate yourself from the community where you live and research in at the same time?
Thoughts on that one?
Do you want to answer?
I feel like I'm talking too much, but my quick answer would be that I don't think that separating is always the answer either, because as researchers, we have to be reflexive and understand we do play a role in that. And so I think trying to be I know what it's not. It's not trying to be completely objective and separate yourself completely from it. It's understanding and working through that and being reflexive about it, and also bringing your students through that reflection process.
Do we have additional?
Maybe just to integrate the two questions together, the first and the second. I think that maybe one of the challenges that we all have could be that, I mean, I think I've faced this myself. I'm like, I haven't really published much on this that I've done. Like, it's not like to capture community geographies for me in publication form, for instance, that would require IRB approval and for sort of the outcomes to be related to those things. I understand, like, I get it. I totally understand it. I don't, you know, I've had to live a parallel life in a sense of like what I publish on versus like what I would consider to be my community geography's identity, if that makes sense. And so I think that like engagement in community organizing or in outreach with communities, one becomes available sometimes by doing certain types of outreach or being present in certain kinds of movements or activities that then opens the door to where maybe research or maybe teaching or other kinds of activities that are related to our professional lives as scholars, like affects then like community organizations' ability to ask for some assistance or on something, or to be present to do that. And so like an example of that would be a few years ago, there's a conversation opened with a community organization in West Virginia because we had built a relationship with them over years about like different approach to doing organizing, which like ultimately resulted, and Valentina should share this in a future conversation, but this concept of a listening project in which organizing, like for state level organizing, begins to develop actually out of storytelling. And that being a pursuit that like a group of individual organizers, women organizers, wanted to pursue. And so then, the research or the support or the sort of outreach from the university by students and faculty was a response to that. But that was all rooted in some other sets of relationships that already pre-existed. And it just sort of utilized the space, to use the term that Patricia pointed, but also the time, to contribute there in that way. But I hope Valentina will write something about that project and others like contributing to it, for publication so people can read about how that happened. But at the same time, it happened, and it happened like it's a tree that fell in the forest and no one was there to hear it, but it happened. Like, and does it matter if it gets published or not? Because it did happen in really important ways. I think for Valentina and for others who participated in it, there's very real reasons to communicate that through writing, but didn't need IRB to advance an organizing project per se. So I think it's a challenge there. It's kind of a gray area. Maybe in
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to, oh, sorry. Am I echoing?
I tell you want to add to what I've been said already. Go ahead.
Okay. Am I repeating myself? Sorry.
There we go. I think that should work. Much better. Okay. I don't want to, the button on my phone says end. I don't want to end this because it's a great conversation. So just to note, Bradley's mentioning Valentina. I'm going to hopefully get your last name right in the first try. Muralidharan. Is that pretty close? Okay. Who is also on the call here. She is another student board member who helped organize this. So I want to recognize her. She's abroad and has a sketchy internet connection, but she's here and present with us. So anyway, let me bump in with the, I'm actually going to jump to the final question that we had prepared beforehand because it's getting to be a little bit later on, and we can go back to Q&A at the end if there's a desire to do that. So the last question essentially is like, as we think about this CGC community, this community geography community as being relatively new, what are some things that you all suggest that we keep in mind in trying to make this a space that's very inclusive, that really is welcoming in ways that the discipline of geography has not been, right? What are some things that we as a group can do to create a more kind of inclusive environment as this thing continues to grow?
Okay, so my answer here is related to a different question that we're not going to cover, but I'm going to
feel free to
share
jump to that too. So the other question was about models to look to. Yeah, so if there's models that you want to suggest that are relevant to this, that's great.
Well, so it was thinking, my thoughts about this are, was first with approaching the work with an interest of sharing space and not taking over space, and really like kind of emphasizing how that can happen. And one of the models that I thought about, a few, had to do with what Bill Bungay and Gwendolyn Warren did for the Detroit Geographical Expedition and Institute in the late 60s, with having an academic and a community member being diligent about solving social problems in Detroit together, and having a long-term set of conversations and changing the data, in ways that spoke to how the needs of the community needed to be met differently, that were not the way that policymakers were presenting information, as well as like law enforcement and a number of different avenues. And so I think that of what Bungie and Warren were able to do, and were open to being in conversation with one another, was really about sharing, information that was both, public, and that also, of course, Bungie did in his publications. But I think it would, my thought here would be about, having what I imagine, of course I can't ask, but what I imagine was, an ethic of care and transparency among the two of them, and within that institute, that I think speaks to what I part of what I would have, like what I would also say about navigating community relationships when you also belong to the community. Like there's, like being transparent about, like the goals and what is happening in that moment, and also taking care of the self, including with being reflexive, is, something that I think should be centered. And like my perspective on what would be central for me. So those are the, like that's kind of the first set of things, that I thought about in thinking about, like really with an emphasis on collaboration and transparency. I think too about, opening up wider engagements is between like the communities, even if they're not local, to go back to what I was, like I'm interested in doing kind of regional work, but I'm also going to point out something that I think was interesting, in that Kate Derrickson, who's at Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, has been doing work in the Gullah Geechee community for quite a while, on the, the Atlantic coast here in the South, including many conversations and collaborations with Queen Quet, who is the leader of the Gullah Geechee community. And they co-taught a class last fall on collaborations between academics and communities, and like being able, even beyond what, like we're in a pandemic and we had to like do everything virtually anyway, like that was clearly like a plan that was in progress before the pandemic took over and like kind of interrupted how we would normally do teaching. Because I imagine that Queen Quet probably would have gone to Minnesota at some, at least at one point in time. But I think that, like utilizing that set of resources that, and being able to creates an advantage for our approach to community geography that's not, that allows us to still do justice and collaborate with people even over wider spaces and times, and that sort of thing. And that, that class ended up doing, a story map for the Gullah Geechee community. Like those graduate students got really invested in that. That's now available for public view. So, but I think it's thinking about, sharing and co-producing, that's really important here, that I think can attract a more inclusive group of people. Because if you have a like pattern and a behavior that's easily seen as being collaborative and not exploitative, then I think that, that opens up for other people to become interested and be engaged with all of our projects.
One of our other panelists want to respond. So the question again is thinking through what are ways that we can kind of, so the other question was models. If we want to think about models that are inclusionary, to blend these two questions together, but ways to think about how can we make this an inclusive or hospitable group moving forward to a variety of folks.
Well, I'll take a stab next, if that's okay, Bradley. I would love those models, Latoya, actually. Thank you for sharing that. And I will just say one quick thing about the model, and then I'd like to address that larger question. We do have a fellowship cohort model program here that we are just fortunate to have the resources because we do have philanthropy sponsorship. So we have a group of 12 to 14 fellows, half of them from the university, half of them from the community, who work together throughout all 12 months of the year. We meet 2 hours a week, and each of them are doing their different projects. And it's just been an amazing experience to get that kind of commitment level. I don't think that that's possible everywhere. You have to have some funding to do that. But we are fortunate, at least for the short term, to be able to do that kind of cohorting. And I really think that resonates with a little bit maybe of the project, like putting people together explicitly. But in terms of like what this community, I think, could do to help our, collective, I guess, ambition to promote more work like this, because I think we really believe in what the kinds of impacts that this approach can bring, is I feel like that it does take resources at the university level. And I think there's this kind of a moment that, and maybe I'm misreading it, but there is increasing public distrust of institutions, increasing, there's always been sort of an anti-elitism, and in some circles about university actors. But if we're going to try to take this seriously, I think this is a tool that universities could look at to say, we want to take this critique seriously. And this is one way that I want to invest in our faculty, our students, to be able to do this kind of a research. That I think it could be a win for universities to invest in more groups on campus, or the resources that community geographers need to do this kind of work. And so maybe as a collective, we can help articulate that case a little bit more strongly, like at a national level. US institutions of higher education need more of what we've got, right? Because our publics are losing faith in us, or they need us, or the problems are bigger than us. We need these kinds of approaches. And I feel like this kind of a collective could amplify, unite that kind of a vocalization, so that when we are in our institution, we, from top down, we kind of get that kind of a support. Because it is really hard one-off to try to make the case, justify it, ask for resources, all those kinds of things. So I feel like that's something, it's a hard thing to do. But as a group, if we are very clear about our messaging, I think we have something to offer our universities in this really strange and transformative, hopefully, moment.
And just to piggyback on that real quick before Bradley talks, I would just add in too, I think sometimes, I've been working on a project here for a few years about housing displacement that was created from new university housing. Sometimes, it's great to work with those publics. Sometimes that's not a story the university wants to tell. So like, there are the projects that look good, and there are the projects that make administrators and state legislators feel uncomfortable. And sometimes it's a story we have to convince the university that's good for them in the long term. It's kind of make the case for why the work we're doing is actually the way you build community trust long term, and not just look for the short term, like let's paper over some checkered histories. Bradley, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I definitely resonate with what Latoya and Patricia's offered, and kind of coming back to Latoya's, I would like to ask Latoya more questions about the example that she shared, because I do think that it presents a real relationship between means and ends. Like, if our ends are community geographies and it's a group of scholars that are getting together all the time to talk about community geographies, then kind of like it ends up in a sign of, it would be really interesting to have presentations in which there's accompaniment between, the community participant leader of the effort and the accompanying faculty members or student or whomever it is, but just like representing the sort of the group that's engaged, and be able to then present a sort of different perspectives, like the difference between, Gwendolyn Warren as an 18-year-old Black woman organizer from Detroit, and Bill Bungie, as an example of the potential for unity of thought, but also potentially differences in how the perceived project was going to unfold and for whom and why. Like, I think that would be a really rich discussion to see play out in different venues, which might mean organizing other kinds of gatherings, other kinds of like kind of critical reflections. And I think the other thing is that I think maybe one maybe difference that I would say this community has that's somewhat different than sort of the AAG kind of community, or even just an action research community, is that like we don't only have to play the research output note. And so I kind of wonder sometimes about the value of having conversations about pedagogies. Because pedagogies and popular education approaches are far more like relatable in some regards to the overarching work that we're doing. It's not only that we're changing our approaches to doing research, but we're also changing our approaches to education. We're changing our approaches to maybe how we're training graduate students, or maybe changing our approaches to how we're training undergraduate students or preparing them, or we're changing our approaches to how we engage with community members, all of which relate to learning, like in co-learning or, co-production of knowledge, but even just learning in general. And like, what does that look like? And, we talk about Dewey, for instance, as an example of someone like in pragmatist philosophy comes up, sometimes in this space. And I'm like, but there's also actual like things that we can think about, not just how to research learning, but how to actually participate in processes of learning over time. And as a community, again, between means and ends, like thinking about how does this community have a different approach to learning and sharing, much similar to like what Latoya and even Patricia are referring to, like where we have regular reflection meetings where we're sharing these experiences, and the people who are participating in projects that we're involved in are also sharing, and it's contributing to the kind of learning through time. So I don't know if this is muddying the waters more or making it more unclear, but I think that maybe if I could summarize, pedagogy, I think would be an interesting thing to consider. And I definitely echo Latoya's point about, broadening the community that's participating in community geographies. But then also thinking about this whole thing as a project of learning from each other on how to do geography differently, how to do scholarship differently, how to do teaching differently. Because that is, as Patricia says, this is like the university, the higher education is, WVU is going through strategic transformation right now, and ASU went through that, a decade ago. And it's like, these, it's kind of run out, the concept of what higher education is, particularly public universities. And so we need to rethink it. Why not?
Right. Yeah, and there's good emerging literature on rethinking land-grant universities in particular, and the ways that we think about what the land-grant mission was historically, what it actually did, and what it might be in more progressive kinds of ways. So we're just about out of time here. I want to just leave space here is there any kind of final words that any of our panelists want to share? I don't think we have any open questions right now. So any last reflections or thoughts that anybody wants to say?
I'd like to thank you, Terry, for organizing this, and also all the great questions from the audience and listeners. I think those are really thought-provoking, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Latoya and Bradley.
Yeah, this has been great. This is a great conversation, and thanks for all of you for being part of this initial event. We hope to have a couple of these every semester on various topics. And so, like I said, hopefully there'll be some details released soon on the second panel this semester, and then maybe some events at AAG as well. This event is being recorded. It'll be posted back up on the Community Geographies Collaborative website. There's a link to that I gave earlier. It's in the chat if anybody wants to see that. So thanks again. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Yay. And hope everybody has a good evening, and look forward to talking to you all again, hopefully in person soon.
Thanks, Jerry, and everybody.
Thank you.